Hello, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today on novel item types, design and development. Let me just work on sharing the rest of my screens and then we will get started. Okay, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Belinda Brenner. I am the Vice President of Client Solutions at ASC. I have about 20 years of experience in high stakes assessment. I worked for 3 healthcare certification boards, and I also um, have worked for a couple of different vendors, including ASC. My experience expands both the content development side as well as some of the operations side, management side of high stakes assessments. And I also taught for a number of years at in a higher education institution. So I have some experience with assessment from the classroom side as well. One of my favorite topics to talk about is innovative item types or novel item types. So I'm very excited to be presenting that to you today. Just to give you a little bit of a background to Assessment Systems Corporation, and particularly the work that I do at Assessment Systems and my team. ASC is a full service testing organization. So we do both test delivery, item banking, as well as providing content consultative services for test development. So we can help with program management, launching certifications, job task analysis, item writing, and we also have a psychometric team, so we can offer psychometric support. So basically the full spectrum of test development and test delivery. So now let's get started in talking about novel item types. When we think about starting an assessment, we often think about what we want to assess. That's the test blueprint. And when we're developing innovative or novel item types, we think about what we're assessing. And of course, the innovative item type is the how we're assessing it. But sometimes in our rush to develop new and innovative item types, we forget about the why. Why do we assess individuals? And we're going to start with why today. And when you're developing innovative items, you need to also always keep in mind why you're assessing. Why do you assess individuals? The concept of assessing occurs throughout our lives, in our personal lives as well as our professional lives. We take a driver's license exam. That's an assessment. A race is an assessment. Who's going to be the fastest? We have performance reviews at work. That's an assessment. Of course, in classrooms, students are assessed. Do they understand the content? Do they have good enough grasp of the content? content to move on to other topics? At what reading level are they operating on? And in our professional world, we have certification exams and licensure exams to make sure that people are functioning at least a minimal competence. That's to protect public safety. So we always want to think about why we're assessing throughout the entire test development lifecycle, but particularly when we're thinking about how we're going to assess it and the item types that we're using. So again, start with why when you think about what's the best way to assess what I need to know about this individual. And in a general sense, the simplest answer to why is solving a problem. This accommodates all different kinds of assessment. What problem are you trying to solve? Who is the fastest runner? Does this person have minimally competence? Can they use a particular software at a competent level? So assessment in general is problem solving. And what we're doing when we're developing innovative or novel item types is trying to figure out a better way to solve the problem that we have at hand. So point number one is don't go straight to how. Think about why. Why should be your beginning point on your venture to develop new item types. Don't get the cart before the horse, in other words. So in this session, we're going to talk about how you get from why to how in a structured, systematic way so that you actually do solve the problem at hand. You solve what you were hoping to achieve when you develop new item types. So we're going to talk about definitions of what a novel item type means. We're going to explain how they differ from traditional item types. We'll talk about some of the key design and measurement principles that should guide their development. We'll also explore some of the innovative features that can be integrated into modern computer-based test items, and then we'll outline the stages involved in design, development, and validation of test items. We have a rather large group, so if you would like to write your questions or comments in the Q&A, that would be great. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So just generally, what is a novel item type? We need to come up with a definition of that first. And there's not one definition available in the literature about what is an innovative. They're sometimes called technically in technology enhanced items or novel items, but there's not a uniform definition for what they are. So the definition that I like is a very broad definition. Any item type that is new to a particular testing program. If you've not used that item type before, it's new to you. Just trying to advance my slides here. There we go. So one of the ways we can think about items is, and the types of items, begin to classify and categorize items, is thinking about them as far as how much constraint they provide to candidate or to test takers when they're responding. So all items can be placed sort of on this continuum of constraint. So highly constrained items like multiple choice items, they're constrained because the candidate only has 4 answer options, or if you're using a 4 answer option, multiple choice, which is the most common. But basically, they're constrained by the number of answer options you have. They can only choose to respond by one of those answer options. So they're constrained in their response. If you think about a more traditional item type like an essay item, there's very limited constraints. So they're very lowly constrained in how they can respond. They may be limited by the word content, but other than that, there may not be any constraint at all. So we can also place more novel item types on this continuum as well. And two of the types of items that I've placed on this continuum, and this is just an example of items, it's not by any means the whole depth and breadth of item types, of course, but two of the items that are on this continuum relate to hotspot items, discrete hotspots and non-discrete hotspots. And I want to talk about the difference because that difference relates to how constrained the candidate is in responding. So let's talk about a discrete hotspot first. A discrete hotspot requires the test taker to select their response from clearly defined and specified areas on an image, diagram, or interface. So in this example, we have a tree and there are three clearly defined areas, 1, 2, and 3. So the item author creates the predefined areas and they're displayed when the item is delivered. So the test taker would select from one of those three areas. Those are the only areas that are operational on the diagram. So let's say the question, as it was in this example, was to identify the trunk. Then they would select 2 as the correct option. But 1 and 3 are essentially distractors, just like they would be in a multiple choice item. The only difference is it's not text-based, it's image-based. So the test taker is still constrained by being able to respond to only one of these 3 images on this item, or only one of the predetermined areas of an image in a discrete hotspot. The difference in a non-discrete hotspot is that while the item author would identify sections of the image, the boundaries of what the correct answer would be, those are not shown to the test taker. So the test taker only sees the image and they can click anywhere on the image to respond. The item is correct or not by whether they click in the predefined image area that has been identified by the item author as correct. So let's say that you have an X-ray, for example, and you're asking to identify the anomaly. The test taker could click anywhere on that X-ray image, but the correct response would be determined by the boundaries that the item author has identified as being consistent with the anomaly on the X-ray. So this provides perhaps some more authentic decision making, because when you have an X-ray in a doctor's office, you're obviously not given predetermined values as to what could potentially be an anomaly. But it also may present some other challenges for delivery or for scoring or obtaining statistics about item performance. One of the things you need to think about scoring is how are you going to QC the item to make sure that it's actually recording properly what a correct response is versus an incorrect response. So does your results feed somewhere provide the coordinates both of the boundaries of the correct response as well as the coordinates of the place that the candidate has clicked? Also, if you are able to perhaps provide some capturing of where they clicked, that would be an incomplete response, and you can actually define those perhaps by having the item writer or the item author identify perhaps plausible distractors on the image. Then you can do some distractor analysis to see what if they're not getting the correct answer, what's throwing them as far as an incorrect response. So that's the two types of hotspot items. If we go back to the diagram, then you can see at the far right end of very low constraints for a more novel item type would be performance stimulation. They are amongst the most unconstrained type of items. Depending on how they're structured, they can place test takers in a dynamic scenario in which each decision changes what the test taker sees next and the task that the test taker is asked to perform next. So they actually can operate sort of like a choose your own adventure story. This requires some thought about how to align each test taker's experience to the same competency framework and blueprint so that a passing score represents the same level of competence. Now, even if the performance simulation is somewhat constrained, so there aren't a myriad of pathways for the test takers, performance stimulation can still require a great deal of time and effort to develop, and to develop in a way that actually achieves your purpose, going back to the why. So I think that the item types sort of in the middle of the diagram might provide the greatest opportunity for more authentic assessment for those perhaps with more limited resources. Another way of thinking about how you can classify items and what innovations you can place within items is to think about the item elements that can be innovated. So we all think about presentation. How does the item look on the screen? What item format are we using? How are we asking the test taker to respond? So you can definitely implement innovations in the presentation, but you can also innovate in other ways as well. So another way that you can innovate is through selection and ordering. The relationships between the items. Are the items, do you want to have a case study or a test split so that there is a stimulus that could be text-based, but it could also be an image, it could be a video, it could be a series of images, it could be a PDF document you have to review, and then you ask them a series of questions about that. Also an adaptive test where the next item a candidate sees is based upon responses, prior responses. That's also an innovative way of creating an innovative testing experience based upon selection and ordering. With navigation and delivery, moving within the items. What do you want them to see on the screen, and how do you want them to interact with that? Are they going to have multimedia assets that they have to review and that have to be delivered with the item? And then finally, innovations can occur in how you're evaluating the item and how you're scoring it. One of the things I do want to mention is that oftentimes we get so cued in when we're developing innovative items on the presentation and the item format and what it's going to look like on the screen, that we have the whole item development and then we toss it over to the psychometricians and say, okay, now we'd like to know how we can score this. That is not the best way of developing innovative items. Scoring needs to be considered from the beginning because, again, the overall concept is why you're doing it. What measurement opportunity do you have to solve? So, key point number 2 is that innovation can come in all shapes and sizes. Something that may be considered innovative for one testing program would not be all that innovative for another. And innovation doesn't just have to reflect what the item looks like on the screen. There are other innovations that you can include in your testing program or in your items as well. So a lot of times when you ask test sponsors why they want to innovate, well, it has to do with perception that, their stakeholders or their examinees think that text-based multiple choice are old, and so they want the bells and whistles. And that's all well and good. You have to consider your perceptions of your stakeholders, but that should not be the only thing you think about. Again, focusing on the measurement opportunity that's available to you and how you can better assess the depth and breadth of the content that you are meant to be assessing. So this is a quote by W. Edwards Deming. We should work on our processes and think about the process, and then the outcome of the process would follow along. So one of the ways to implement innovative items and processes is to think about developing innovative items in a design thinking framework. And if you're not familiar with design thinking, it's a problem-solving approach that focuses on understanding individuals' needs and then iteratively developing solutions through experiment and feedback. So instead of starting with what solution can we build, a design thinking mindset starts with who are we designing for, what do they truly need, and why. So in a test, we're frequently designing for the examinees, but we're also designing for the stakeholders. If we're doing a certification exam, we want to make sure that if we're passing an individual, they do have the minimal competence. So we always need to keep those two populations or those two purposes in mind. We want to be fair to the examinees, but we also want to make sure that we achieve the purpose for which the exam was intended. So if you are familiar with design thinking, you may be thinking the common stages are empathizing, understanding users and their needs, define a problem statement, ideating, generating items or generating ideas without judgment, and then prototyping and testing. However, I like to think about design thinking in this framework that was introduced by Leideke and Ogilvy in a book, Designing for Growth. And I think it's simpler and easier to understand and really hits home of what you're trying to do. And their framework is what is, so what is happening right now, what if, what could we do, what wows, and then what works. So let's take a look at how we can fit some of the concepts of novel item types and what we need to do to develop them in a systematic process in this design thinking framework. So this is not everything that needs to happen when we think about developing novel item types, but these are some of the most important things that perhaps you want to do when you're developing an innovative item type. So starting with brainstorming. Brainstorming is kind of the what if, getting SMEs to talk about what is the measurement opportunity. In a certification world, what is the current state of practice? When I did this with a group that was developing some new item types for a medical imaging exam, they talked about the state of art of the machinery and what it required the technician to do and how that might be changing. So what is the first step, and looking at involving SMEs for brainstorming. What's the measurement opportunity? What are we trying to do here? What are we trying to achieve? And then the what if is where sort of the fun part starts, and thinking about storyboarding. How might we achieve this? And actually, we'll take a look at a storyboard in a minute, but beginning to jot ideas down on paper of how we might be able to achieve better measurement. How can we assess students or examinees in a better way? And so storyboarding that. And then the what wows is beginning to prototype some of those ideas, and we'll talk about what a prototype is and why prototypes are valuable and how you can use them. And then lastly, usability studies, what works. One of the things to think about in what works is what's interfering with us achieving the measurement opportunity. What we want is their construct irrelevant variance, because you're assessing the examinee's ability to understand what they're supposed to be doing with the item, more that you're actually measuring their competence in the task at hand. So usability studies can be very helpful with looking at some of that interference and noise. So one of the things that I have tried in the past to talk about with SME brainstorming, and this was for an exam for management accountants, and they were interested in doing a case study exam as kind of a capstone for their entire sort of professional education experience. And so what we did was we actually adapted the concept from agile software development about developing user stories. And we developed a series of user stories about, based upon the test blueprint, what an individual would have to do in their role to demonstrate the knowledge and skills and abilities that were on the test blueprint. So we were kind of looking at fleshing out some of the test blueprint areas more to get the SMEs thinking about what they wanted to test, what was important to test, and maybe scenarios that can be used to test. So that was sort of an introductory exercise to actually doing the storyboards. So as you see here, in a user story, you have the role, and professionals can serve a number of different roles. And then what action do they need to take? and what goal do they have in taking that action. So again, this was just to get the SMEs thinking about how to come up with some ideas about scenarios or exercises that they could potentially do to assess in a sort of case study situation. And then the next step is beginning to get and capture some of those ideas on paper by doing a storyboard. So a storyboard, people do not have to be good artists. It's basically just doing a rough drawing of the ideas you have. So in this example, we not only storyboarded the item, but we also were thinking about some of those other elements of what would need to be considered if we were to develop and deliver an item type. So at the bottom, it talks about how the response will be evaluated, and they begin to put some ideas about the evaluation. And then we also looked at, were there any special instructions, or were there any things that we needed to deliver with the item or to navigate from and away the item. And so in this particular example, this is an example from, it could be a photography exam, it could be a medical imaging exam, but they're given two images, a bad image that may be blurry, or it's just really not a very clear image, and then they're given a good image. And the goal, the exercise, is how to get from A to B. And so they're given 3 setting options of 3 things that they could change. Maybe it's the brightness, or it's a contrast. And they're asked to, for each of the setting, identify whether it should be increased. So increase the brightness, no change, or decrease. And so this was just one storyboard from a whole list of, or a whole group of storyboards that a SME workshop group may come up with. So from the storyboarding, one of the things we did then is, before we moved on to prototyping, we had a whole range of storyboards. You would have a whole range of storyboards, and then you would begin to evaluate those storyboards and weed out those storyboards to see which is most feasible or less feasible. And to do that, you could use the low fidelity storyboards that you have, which are sort of low fidelity prototypes. The storyboards are simplified, rough representations. And so you could use those for thinking about whether you need to go a little further with this item, and again, weed them out. But there also are 2 other types of prototyping. One is medium fidelity, and medium fidelity prototypes introduce the logic and some of the, they refine the picture more. So for instance, we developed in one particular project I was working on, we developed PowerPoint presentations. It was actually the item type that I just showed you, with the good image and the bad image. And we actually created a PowerPoint that would mimic the item. And then we even had functionality from PowerPoint to indicate if the candidate clicked increase or decrease or no change, so they would actually see what was happening when they were responding to the item. And I'll talk a little bit about how then we use those medium fidelity prototypes in usability studies. And then you have high fidelity prototypes. Those are the ones that are perhaps actually developed in the software that you're using. They look very much like what you the final product would look like. So you can use all of these different stages of prototyping in different parts of your novel innovative item development. The low fidelity item type of prototypes could be used to sort of evaluate your storyboards. You can use medium fidelity in usability stories. High fidelity you may want to use in perhaps some pilot testing. Sometimes the reason you want to use perhaps something other than the high fidelity prototypes is it can cost money to develop that in the software. And what if you have to change it around? So sometimes using a more medium fidelity prototype will save time and money, because then you can refine and reiterate the improvements without having to reprogram and redo your item types in the actual software itself. So let's talk about usability studies then. Usability studies are a way of determining what's going right and what's going wrong with the item before you actually implement it. And they're very helpful and useful tools. A process like the Think Out Loud method can be used for usability studies with a small number of examinees or subjects, so even just a handful of them. And in the Think It Out Loud method, what you ask them to do is, as they're interacting with the item, you ask them to say exactly what they're thinking. So if they're thinking, I don't know what to do next, or this is confusing, or I don't get how I'm supposed to respond, they would say that out loud. So the outcomes are, as I mentioned earlier, to identify potential construct irrelevant variants that would interfere with them responding and really showing and demonstrating their knowledge. It would help guide tutorials and instructions. Okay, we need to develop a tutorial about this, or our instructions need to include this. And it supports just continuous improvement, that iterative version. The first time you do something may not be the best, so you want to keep iteratively developing it. So point number 3, process makes perfect, or at least better. But it doesn't end with design. When you're thinking about innovative items, you need to, because some of them can be very expensive to develop, for one thing, you need to think about the feasibility of using them. So these are just some criteria to think about. How scalable are they? Are there multiple scenarios or areas of the blueprint that can be assessed using this particular item type? The scoring opportunities they have, are there multiple measurement opportunities? If the item type is going to take 10 minutes to respond to, but then only yields, one measurement point, is that the best use of the candidate's time? So that sort of time versus benefits measurement opportunity scenario. Does it lend itself to automation? Can you create item variants through automation? Again, the information versus time kind of trade-off. The information you get from the item versus the time it takes. The effort of the SMEs in writing the item, the effort of delivering the item, the effort of the test takers in responding to the item, the cost, memorability. Is the item type going to be more conducive to IVUS harvesting, or people remembering the item so that they can share it? The complexity, again, is there going to be a need for training or tutorials in order for your test takers to understand what's being required of them in the item? And configurability. Is this an item type that can be delivered only on one platform because it requires software development, or is it something that could be delivered on multiple platforms? If it's very expensive and it's only going to be delivered on one platform because it was custom development for you on that platform, what happens if you want to switch platforms? So all of those things need to be considered. And then also configuration. Configuration just means the final bits and pieces of what you're going to need to do to actually deliver this item live. So finalizing the scoring, doing the studies to make sure the item is scoring appropriately and we have the best measurement opportunity. What technical specifications need to be provided? Does it require software development? What item writing materials need to be provided to the item authors, and your candidate communication plans. How are you going to communicate to candidates that you have a new item type? So point number 4 is design. This is a quote from Steve Jobs. Design is not just what it looks and feels like, it's how it works. So we may want the bells and whistles in new innovative item types because they look more modern and they look like you have a more modern test, but you really need to think about all the other things as to how it's actually going to work to achieve the purpose of your examination. So in my experience, the best way of designing innovative items is to create a multidisciplinary team that is involved in the development from the onset. And that includes your subject matter experts, people who understand the technology of how you're going to author and deliver the item, obviously your psychometricians and your psychometric experts, and also the assessment specialists or test developers who understand about writing content, about providing guidelines to candidates, that kind of thing. So point number 5, don't forget the 3 Ps. Planning, it's not going to be done overnight. Process, you have to have a process for creating these items. And people, you need to not only think about the stakeholders and the students or the examinees, but you also need to think about the people that need to be involved in the process of development. And lastly, I just wanted to think about, the future of assessment and some of probably the newer and more creative things. And this is just a list of some of the things that excite me more. And the first is the use of virtual or augmented reality. There's a growing body of research on the use of AI and augmented reality and virtual reality in healthcare education and assessment. And so what is that going to do with in the future about how we assess test takers and examinees? Dynamic assessment. This is a concept where there's an interactive approach to assessment that evaluates not only what a person knows, but how they're able to adapt when they receive feedback. So it focuses not on just on getting it right, but also do they have the learning tools? And if you think about how quickly, in our professional world, things are changing, it's not just what we know now, but how much we can learn and how adaptable we are. Confidence as a construct is one that's particularly interesting to me. And this has been around for a while. I think the first study that I saw was in the 1950s or 1960s. And this is not only assessing whether the examinee gets the question right or wrong, but also how confident they are in their response. And I think about this as maybe being particularly useful in something like medicine or healthcare. If you have a doctor who is overconfident, so they think that they're right, but they're getting some of the questions wrong. Overconfidence could mean that they may be more susceptible to misdiagnosing because they rush to judgment, or they're overconfident in their abilities. Whereas underconfidence might mean that they delay diagnoses. So it's evaluating not only do they get questions right or wrong, but how confident do they tend to be in their responses, particularly responses of when they're right, but they're underconfident, confident, or when they're wrong, but they're confident that they're right. And then lastly, real-time or lab assessments, where you can be connected to virtual machines or lab machines to do assessments. These are just an example of some types, perhaps, of more novel or assessments in the future, but I know that there are many others. So we do have time for questions, but just some key takeaways here are design and development of novel item types takes time, effort, and resources. It's not going to happen overnight. It depends on how complex of your development you want as to how long it's going to take. It requires a multidisciplinary effort, and you need to be both creative in coming up with ideas as well as analytical in judging those ideas and evaluating those ideas as to whether they're actually feasible and they do what you intend them to do. And then good measurement should be at the heart of novel item design and development. So with that, I will see if there are any questions or any comments, and I'm going to review the comments. Elaborate more on confidence as a construct. Yes, and I can get you some references, so I will. I know that there are some older references from even going back to the 1950s. And so I will see if I can pull those up. And when we post this on our website, we'll also post the references. And so what would happen is you would ask the question, and then there would be a secondary question of how confident are you? And that would be like on a Likert scale, and to rate your confidence. Exactly. Someone else said that about using pre-trained AI avatars to act as interviewers to assess oral production in second language. Very interesting concept. And to be honest, I don't know much about that, but one of the things to think about with pre-trained AI or avatars is sort of the uncanny valley of valley where it's maybe uncomfortable because they're a little human, but they're not totally human. So that's something to think about. What best practices would you suggest for developing AI-driven immersive simulation with real-time adaptive interactions for test takers? I think, again, that's a very complicated situation, a very complicated, complex novel item type. So I think, again, making sure that you have a multidisciplinary team involved, that you do usability study, you do pilot testing, you iterate, all those things that I talked about, and realize that it's going to take time. And so make sure, and it'll also take money. So make sure that you recognize the effort that's going to be required. Anyone else have any questions or suggestions? What have you tried? What's worked for you? How about a test that records the interaction of a candidate in teams like conversation, where they receive questions in writing, in video, and have to respond in writing, speaking, and so on? Potentially, again, just make sure that you understand exactly what you're trying to measure, and that you're doing it in a way that actually puts what the measurement opportunity is first. With that, I'd like to thank you all for attending and your attention, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.